Hello everyone, welcome to part 7 of the build series of the sc10 short course truck. Before I carry on with part 7, I'll have to apologise for a bit of a stuff up with the previous video. While I was filming it, decided to have a bit of a spaz attack, and it reckoned that it had a buffering overload or overflow or something of that description, so I had to start filming again and re-edit it and join the two parts together, so there'll be a little bit, there's a bit cut out. So what I will do before we carry on is I'll just show you what I was trying to explain in the previous video. With the turnbuckles, there is a notch. Okay, so with your turnbuckles, whether it's the steering or the camber, there's a slight notch just there. You probably can't see it, but they build a notch into these, so it helps with the direction for turning. So basically, it helps with when you're adjusting the camber or the toe, or even maybe, well, yeah, that's just it, camber and toe. The notch is just there to should give you the direction of where of which way it's pointing, and so that's what I was trying to explain. And unfortunately, due to the editing, I had to cut that out because of the problem with the camera having its spaz attack. So that's what I wanted to thought I'd just explain that to you now, just so it's in your mind for when you're building the truck. Alrighty, so on to part 7, and the first part of part 7 is going to be building the diff. So we have all the necessary parts. One thing I will make mention to you, you have the ball bearing, or the diff balls in here. Now I would recommend that you leave the diff balls in the bag. As you can tell, they're very small and they have a habit of disappearing if you're not careful. So good idea, just leave them in the bag. And the other things you will need for this, apart from tools, are diff grease, and for this part of the build I am using some Tamiya anti-wear grease. Now you're probably wondering, well, why aren't you using associated? Well, I'll show you why as we go on with the build. So those are the two of the things that you will need for this part of the build. So for it, we need the diff gear, the ball diff outdrives, the thrust bearing assembly. These little balls here are for the part of the thrust bearing. These are your diff balls, and we have bearings and so forth. So what we need to do is get our diff balls ready. Okay, now what I like to do first, okay, so we have the diff outdrives, the drive rings, and we have the diff balls and the diff gear. What I like to do when it comes to making a diff, excuse me, is I like to do the diff outdrives. Okay, so in this case, so what I'll do is place the drive ring on the out drive, and then what we'll do is we'll get some diff grease, and we'll just squirt some on. Like so. Now another little tool that'll come in handy is this little gizmo. What it is a telescopic magnet. And the reason being, as you see, those are the diff balls. So all the diff balls are on the magnet, so they won't disappear on you. Now, one of the things I like to do, we'll just put that on the plastic so we don't get any fur. Okay, what I like to do is get some diff grease and put it in each hole that the diff balls go into. Air bubble. And what this does is it helps the diff ball to stay in the hole. Okay, so we've got grease there. Don't be worried, about using too much grease. Sometimes it's better to use a little bit too much. Another thing too, bearings. You need your diff bearings. Like so. Put the diff gear on. As you can see, it looks like that. Okay, now the fun part. Now, I've just got a scalpel here. You can also use this little part. This is actually for building the shock, but it'll come in handy. So I'll just put. See, this is what I was talking about. So now I can't find it. Ah, there it is. Okay. I'll just use the scalpel. Just move it, put the diff balls in. Probably just put them all in at once and just move it around. So you'll find that, fortunately, because they've been on a magnet, they will be a little bit magnetized. But once they go into the grease, they'll just sit there. So this is a little bit time consuming. It does get a little frustrating. Probably just use that because they're kind of mucking around with the metal on the scalpel there, on the hobby knife. Okay, so that is all the diff balls in. So now we do the next part. Some more grease. Okay. And carefully place it in. Just give it a firm push, just so, and so now it's in. You'll feel it slip, which, because it hasn't been, because you got a tension, it's a bowl diff, so it has to be tensioned. So that's that bit there. Put that there. Now the next part is to assemble the thrust bearing. Now this, if you thought building the diff was a bit awkward, this is going to be fun. Not. Because a lot of thrust bearings, they come pre-assembled and you slide them on, whereas with the associated ones you have to actually make the thrust bearing up. And you'll need that. And you'll also need this is the thrust spring. These are your thrust bearing plates. Yeah, is that the correct? Yep, that's the correct one. You've got all these different bolts here, so we don't need diff, blah blah blah. Okay, so now this is where it gets a bit awkward. Okay, so what you need to do is place the first thrust bolt plate on, like so. You see it? It's a bit hard to see because it's small. Now what you'll need to do is get your magnet. If you don't have a magnet, I mean, just be a little extra careful. So there they are, the little thrust bearings. Okay, now what you need to do here, this is where the anti-wear grease comes in handy. It's real sticky, and I find, especially in these cases, it works better than the black grease. This is just a personal preference of mine. Now, with the scalpel or hobby knife, you get some anti-wear grease, and you place it. It's going to be a little bit hard to show on the camera, but you place it on like so, quite generously. A little bit more. Okay, now this is where the fun starts. Now the reason why I use the anti-wear grease, because as you see, you have to build the thrust bearing. So being very sticky, the ball bearing will stick to the grease. So I'll just bring it up to the camera. Oop, there we go. So as you can see, the little balls are stuck to the plate because of the grease I'm using. Oop. Now, what you need to do is get some more anti-wear grease. Another generous helping, and just smear it on like that. And then very carefully put it on like so. So there you have it, folks. I'll just bring it up to the camera. That is the completed thrust bearing. Very painful and annoying to build. Okay, so now with that we need, what I'll need to do is I'll need to pull apart the diff again, because I can't remember okay, so I've got to pull this one off. Okay. Now very carefully stick the thrust bearing in through like so. There we go. Now you don't have to worry because the outside, or the inner part of this outdrive here will actually hold the bearings in, so you don't have to worry about them coming out at any point. So now we can put this back on. Okay. Now what we have now we need is the spring. It'll go in like so. And cut this bit off here. And that, what that will do is that will go over the spring there, because it's threaded. Now when you're doing this, you can use certain things. No, that's not going to fit. Ah, here we go. What you generally have to do is push that on, because the spring will add a little bit of resistance. Now the other thing what we'll do is we'll put this little section on here just after. So what we need is the correct tool. Is that the right size? Yes, it is. Okay. Now here it says that you need to tighten the screw down. Oop. You need to tighten the screw down so that the little tabs go all the way. It compresses the spring completely. So that's what we have to do here. So it's grabbed on, so we don't need that tool at the moment. So now we'll turn it. Butterfingers. I'll need this tool again by the looks of things. Okay, now it says to actually do it while, so that the spring's compressed completely. Now that's the diff assembly. We'll just put this last little, I probably should cut it off. And that's just this is just a protective cap, so when you put your drive shafts through, it doesn't damage the screw. Okay folks, that there is the diff housing. Well, that is the diff. Now it says, the reason why it says to tighten it all the way is because obviously you have to run this in. So when the diff's run in, you recheck it again to make sure it's tight, and yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Alright folks, stay tuned for part 8.